Hi everyone. Welcome to this Growing Manchester webinar on vermiculture and composting with special guest Klaudia. Klaudia is a volunteer coordinator at Plattfields Market Garden, who we had on a couple of weeks ago. She helps to lead volunteer sessions and organise and host events on site. My name's Emily and I work for social enterprise So the City. We're based in Manchester, as is Klaudia, of course, with Plattfields. This webinar is part of a programme we run which is funded by the NHS called Growing Manchester. The aims of the project are to improve access to sustainable food in Manchester and increase the health and well-being of the wider community. So this is our number 11 webinar, and it's amazing that we've gotten to that point. We've run so many brilliant webinars over the last few weeks with some great guest speakers. Covering all sorts of things from keeping chickens to setting up green alleyway greening projects, foraging, food poverty mapping, urban trees, all sorts of stuff. So you can find a lot of these recordings on Vimeo. And if you want any more information about any of the presentations, you want any of the slides or follow up resources, things like that, then you can just email me on info@sothecity.org. This week, as mentioned, we have Klaudia talking about composting and vermiculture. So just a bit of context, a bit of intro. The average person throws away 9 times their own body weight in waste every year. As much as 30% of this is made up of food and garden waste, I found out. But when we throw that food away, we're not only wasting the food, but all the energy that's gone into making it, of course. In the UK, your green bin is delivered to as in-vessel composting facilities. So this is where they take the material, they shred it, and they leave it to break down, and they create compost in just 6 weeks. This is used as soil improver on agricultural land. You can do this process as well in anaerobic conditions. So without oxygen in an anaerobic plant situation, sort of thing. So in this instance, you can create biogas, which can be used to make energy. In the UK, the energy we get from recycling food waste in this way creates enough electricity to power 200,000 homes each year, and is worth more than 220 million to the economy. But of course, you can make use of this brilliant waste material, food and garden waste, at home as well. In our Growing Manchester programme, composting always is part of our 6-week gardening course because it's so important. And a composting area is often one of the first things we set up in a community garden space. Making compost is a free and easy way to enrich the soil and improve its structure, and an opportunity to process the huge amounts of plant waste generated when food growing and gardening. As the most nutrient-rich bit of our soil is at the very top, it can be so easily eroded away by wind and rain, and even by excessive weeding. So adding compost to soil can increase the levels of soil organic matter in this topsoil by providing nutrients and habitat to organisms, and it binds soil particles, increasing water holding capacity. Overall, just helping us to grow better veggies and more of them. Pass over to Klaudia now, who will tell you all about how you can make your own beautiful, dark, rich and crumbly compost, plus how you can use wormeries to recycle food scraps and garden waste, both in your garden and inside your home.
Cool. Well, okay. Hi everyone. I'm Claudia. Like Emily said, I'm a volunteer coordinator at the Plattfields Market Garden, which is an organic community market garden in Plattfields, Manchester. I have my own little project called the Branch Project, which aims to educate others as well as myself on sustainable growing and growing to enhance the environment. I just finished my environmental science degree, and one area that really stood out to me during my time at uni has been the area of agriculture and soils, and especially soil health, which is why I'm here today to talk to you about how you can build soil health from the comfort of your own home through making your own compost in 2 different ways, one of them involving worms. So today you'll be learning about how to start your own compost heap, what conditions are needed for a compost heap to function at its best, and how to compost when you can't have a compost heap, and that's what I'll talk about while I'm composting. So what actually is composting? Well, this is a simple diagram of it. So composting refers to the process of breaking down something that was once living, so for example, food or garden waste, into its primary basic components. And then through this, you're retrieving any leftover nutrients from that previously living material. And you turn that waste into nutritious fertilizer that can return to the land and nourish it and allow us to grow healthy and nutritious food, like Emily said earlier. And it also ensures our soils are functioning how they should. And this decomposition process is supported by a plethora of organisms. Like you can see in the diagram, you've got earthworms, snails and slugs, woodlice, and also the invisible guys like bacteria and fungi. And this process couldn't happen without them. And this is just a little diagram showing even more of the animals that are involved in this process. So why should you bother making your own compost? Well, one, it's a really easy way to replenish soil nutrients. So if you imagine a huge farm and let's say it's filled with kale, the soil on that farm is being depleted with every single bit of kale that is grown. And once that kale is harvested and removed from that land, you're also removing all those nutrients that the kale has been using for its growth. So if you add nothing back, there is less and less nutrients available for the next crop, and you can struggle to produce sufficient and healthy food. Similarly, compost promotes healthy soils because it promotes water retention, so it allows the soil to hold more water, making it available for plants. And also, it promotes the soil structure. It provides air spaces and airflow throughout the soil, which promotes aerobic or conditions in which oxygen is present, which are needed for decomposition, which I'll explain in a bit more detail later on. Yeah, and also think of compost as feeding soil life. It's great food for them, it stimulates their activity, and it allows them to carry out the decomposition process and keep fertilizing our soils. Composting also reduces your carbon footprint. So it prevents food waste from going to landfill, where it can be a source of methane because it breaks down in conditions when there is not much oxygen present. So it breaks down in anaerobic conditions. And this can release methane, which is a greenhouse gas that is way more potent than CO2 at promoting global warming because it's more effective at trapping heat. So obviously we don't want that. A statistic I found says that about 11% of all the greenhouse gas emissions that come from the food system could actually be reduced if we just stop wasting food. And another reason for making your own compost is that it just saves you a bit of money. If you make your own, you don't have to worry about finding affordable organic and peat-free compost because you can just make it yourself. Right, so how do we start a compost heap, and what do I actually mean by a compost heap? So I'm referring to things like you can see in the photo. So it's just a compost pile that is located outside. So it can be a wooden bay, like on the left, or a plastic container. And also just a note before I get into this that there's many different ways of composting. And once you're comfortable with the basics, which I'm covering today, I definitely encourage you to research the different methods that exist out there. So for example, hot composting, composting animal waste, or even human waste. Like there's a lot of different things you can look into. But today I'm just talking about how to compost your food scraps and garden waste. So the way decomposition occurs in nature is that leaves, branches, fruit, and any other bits will fall to the ground. And over time, all the soil organisms will carry out a variety of processes that will slowly break down that stuff into smaller and smaller pieces that will eventually feed the soil. However, in nature, this can take quite a bit of time. And luckily, we can manipulate these processes to speed up decomposition in our own compost heaps at home. So when you start your own compost pile, you want to make sure that you're providing contact with the soil to allow easy access for the decomposers. So if your compost pile is a wooden bay, like in the last photo, you want to make sure you place that over already existing soil, because again, it just allows all the earthworms, all the bugs, all the bacteria to move into that compost and start the decomposition process. But if you're using a plastic container where you don't have that contact with the soil, what you want to do is add some soil from the outside, add some litter and leaves, and maybe you might already have some compost that you can add to that. Just kind of inoculate your compost bin with those great organisms. So now you've got somewhere to keep your compost. So now you can start adding your waste. So a big rule in composting is that you want a good mix of browns and greens. Greens refers to the more fresh, still kind of living things that are a source of nitrogen. So this will be like food scraps, grass clippings, coffee or tea. And the browns refers to the already dead stuff, so stuff that is a source of carbon, and that refers to like cardboard, paper, leaves or sticks. And here, don't get too bogged down with the details of this, but there is a golden ratio for decomposition, and that's 2 parts nitrogen per 1 part carbon. So for every 1 bucket of brown material you add, you'd want to add 2 buckets of green material. However, this isn't always practical because you have the green waste that you have and you just want to throw it in your compost heap. So don't bother too much with things exactly right. Just make sure you have a good mix of browns and greens and you'll be fine. So why do you actually need this mix? So if you have too many greens, you have too much nitrogen. Your pile can begin to smell, which is because the bacteria that use this nitrogen, if there's too much of it, they can't use all of it up. So you've got leftover nitrogen that gets converted into something called ammonia, which starts to smell. With too much carbon, the decomposition process can slow down, which is again because you just don't have the right balance of nutrients for the right conditions for the microorganisms to carry out the decomposition. It's also important that in your compost pile you have materials of various sizes, and this is important because it provides airflow, it provides those air spaces which allow for oxygen to flow through and stimulate decomposition. You don't want to have any clumps of material that become anaerobic. You want to have air spaces. And this can also be promoted by just turning your pile over once in a while. You can do that as often as you want or as little as you want, but I think the more often you do it, the quicker you get compost. But also do remember that you should have loads of soil organisms moving through that compost pile and aerating it for you as well as they move. One time you should definitely turn your compost over is if it gets waterlogged. Sorry, and this is just a table of green materials and brown materials. So like I said earlier, greens would be coffee grounds, tea leaves, veggie scraps, and then browns would be eggshells, cardboard, tree bark, wood chips, dry leaves. If you are in an area that receives a lot of rain, or if you're in a period of heavy rain, try and find something that covers your compost, so like a little roof, or maybe put a piece of old carpet on there, or like even cardboard. Just make sure that your compost pile isn't closed off completely because that prevents the flow of oxygen and that can promote anaerobic conditions. And the reason we don't want anaerobic conditions in our compost pile is because aerobic organisms, or the ones that live in the presence of oxygen, are way better decomposers than anaerobes, those that live without oxygen. Also, anaerobes can also sometimes release compounds that can be toxic to your plants, and they can also release hydrogen sulfide, which stinks like rotten eggs. So if you want efficient decomposition and a compost pile that doesn't smell disgusting, you just want to ensure there is that oxygen throughout your compost heap, because without the oxygen, the aerobes will die and the anaerobes will take over. You also want to prevent too much rain from getting a compost heap, as there is a chance that the nutrients within that compost heap will literally just be washed away and carried away with the rain, and you'll be losing everything that you want from your compost heap. If your compost pile does get waterlogged, turn it over loads, just kind of expose it to the air, promote that evaporation. However, it is important that your compost heap stays moist, but it should never be waterlogged. So if you grab some compost and you're able to squeeze water out of it like a sponge, that is way too much. And you need that moisture again to provide the right conditions for decomposers, especially earthworms, which I'll talk about later. And if you're in a period of hot weather like we have just been a few weeks ago, then feel free to water your compost heap. And one thing that you can do to speed up decomposition is to chop up the things you add to your compost. So you can shred leaves or grass clippings or cardboard. You can cut your food scraps into smaller pieces, as this provides more surface area for the microbes to act on, and that speeds up the decomposition process. So what can you actually add to your compost pile? In the green box, you've got stuff that you can add. In the brown box, you've got stuff that you shouldn't add. So the stuff that you can add is food scraps, garden waste, newspaper, cardboard, eggshells, coffee grounds, all the other things that you can see on there. Things that you shouldn't add is stuff like cooked food, dairy, or meat. This can attract rats and can be a source of disease, so try to avoid that. And do not add anything that's been exposed to harmful chemicals, and don't add any diseased plants. Don't add coal ash, as this can have certain chemicals and heavy metals that can actually be harmful to your plants. And for the same reason, Don't add any black walnut tree leaves or twigs, as these contain a chemical called juglone, which is toxic to plants. And this is because black walnut is an allelopathic plant, which means that they release chemicals to kind of suppress the plants around them, which is a really interesting way of growing, I think. So how do you know your compost pile is actually working? Well, if you stick your hand in it, you should feel warmth. That's because warmth is just a byproduct of the decomposition process. You should no longer be able to see the material that you've added to the compost pile, so any banana peels, grass clippings should just not be there anymore. The compost pile will shrink after a while. This is because everything's just being broken down into smaller pieces, and it should have a nice earthy smell. The average time in the UK that it takes for compost to be ready tends to be between 6 months and a year. Obviously, there are things that you can do to speed this up, and it highly depends on the weather and stuff. So that's just the average, but you can speed up the process. And once your compost is ready, use it as soon as possible, or store it somewhere that's cool and sheltered from the rain so you don't lose the nutrients. So that's that on compost heaps. But what if you can't actually have that? So what if you're renting and you can't really have a compost heap? What if you just don't have outside space? What do you do? Well, this is where the worms come in. Vermicompost, great. Vermicompost is essentially a compost pile that is enclosed in a container with earthworms as the primary decomposers. So the worms eat through the green waste and any microorganisms that are present. They excrete that, and that's your compost, and that's called worm castings. It's also referred to as vermicompost, vermiculture, worm farming. So I'll be using those interchangeably. And the worms used for this process are not just any random worm you'll find outside, which I find quite interesting because I thought that every single worm is a composting worm. So I was thinking, why should I buy these special composting worms? But actually, studies find that the red wrigglers, also known as tiger worms, are the most efficient worms for this kind of thing. And they're also the most adaptable to living within a container because they spend their time at the top layer of the soil. So that just makes them a bit more adaptable for living in the contained space. So why should you have a vermicompost? Why should you have a worm farm? Well, I think the main attraction of it is that you can compost inside. So like I said earlier, it's something that you can keep in your garage. It's something that you can even do in your kitchen cupboard. So it's friendly for those that can't have a compost heap outside. And it's also friendly if you move a lot. I'm moving in a few weeks and I'll be able to bring my compost with me, which is pretty cool. Also, studies find that vermicompost is very nutritious. It promotes plant root and shoot growth and improves seed germination. And also it's just a fun thing to do. So how to vermicompost. By the way, I do have a blog post on this which we will send out to everyone, so you have like instructions to follow if you want to set up your own worm farm. So what you'll need a container. Mine's just like a plastic storage box. It's a 65-liter box, which is roughly 23 by 15 by 12 inches. We can also use something like an old sink or a bathtub. You just need a container that it has a solid bottom and sides, but it also needs to have some airflow. So for example, in my plastic container, I drilled some holes in it to provide airflow. But if you're using something like a bathtub, obviously the top is open to the air, so you don't actually need to do anything there. I'd advise not to use any wooden material for this purpose, just because it might rot over time. So yeah, once you have your container, you want to add your bedding, and your bedding refers to the material that your worms will be living in. So that's kind of mimicking the soil. And this can be stuff like coconut fiber, shredded cardboard, newspaper, soil and litter, any compost you may already have, maybe some sand. I added 5 inches to my wormery when I started. That's because that's all I had access to, but it seemed to work. So I'd recommend at least 5 inches of bedding when you start. So then you actually need your composting worms. So like I said earlier, red wriggler worms or tiger worms are great for this. I bought mine online from Yorkshire Worms or Yorkshire Wormery or something, and they've done really great. They've actually, I think they've reproduced as well, which is really cool to see. Right, so you've got your bedding, you've got your worms. Now you can start adding food. So obviously, the more worms you have, the more food you can add. I think there's a statistic that says that a worm can eat half of its body weight in a day. But in the first few weeks of your wormery, I recommend not adding that much food because the worms will need a few weeks to just get used to the surroundings. So they won't eat much, and that's okay. That's supposed to happen. When I feed my worms, I kind of do it whenever I remember to. So one thing with wormery is that you can't add too much food in it because it will start to rot, it will start to stink. And this is kind of where observation comes in. You kind of have to check up on your wormery and see if things are being eaten. If they're not, and if they're rotting away, remove them. But like if you have a small wormery, then like a handful of food a week maybe might be enough. But again, this is kind of where you have to observe and see how your worms are acting. Where to keep your wormery? You want to keep it in a cool and dark place. So my friend told me how his worms actually cooked because he kept his wormery in the sun. I think we can all agree that's a horrible way to go. So keep your worms somewhere that's between 10 to 20 degrees. And once it gets really cold, you can actually wrap your wormery in a fleece or something to provide some warmth, as the worms will slow down their activity as it gets colder. So you want to keep the worms out of direct sunlight. This is because earthworms breathe through their skin, and they need moisture on their skin to absorb oxygen, so they avoid the sun to prevent drying out. So you want to keep them in a dark place, and for a similar reason, you need to have moisture in your wormery. So if your wormery is dry, just add some water or tea or coffee even, and maybe add that once in a while to make sure that your wormery stays moist. And every few weeks, I'd recommend adding some bedding as well, as the worms will eat through this. And again, all of this is in the blog post, so if you want to start your own wormery, you'll have like a guide to follow. So what can you add to your wormery? You can add the same stuff as all the stuff in your outside compost heap, but you don't want to add acidic foods. The worms don't like that, so you don't want to add any citrus, onion, or garlic. The worms really like boiled rice, which is quite interesting. Like if you add it, it'll be gone within a few days. I like giving mine bananas because you can, over time, literally see the banana decomposing and disappearing, which I think is really interesting. When will your vermicompost be ready? It can be ready in as little as 2 months. I know I had some worm castings ready just within 2 months, and you know you've got worm castings if you have material that smells really earthy. Again, you shouldn't really recognize the green waste that you've been adding because it's been eaten and excreted out. And the worm castings are also quite soft and like fluffy. It's kind of hard to describe. It's the kind of thing where once you have them, you'll know you have them. But yeah, it's just like this really soft, nice smelling compost looking thing. And in terms of harvesting your compost, well, you can just do the easy thing and grab a handful, and that's that. Or you can start adding all your green waste to one side of your wormery. With time, the worms will move over to that side, so that will leave the other side ready for harvesting. But again, you should kind of look through that and take out any stuff that hasn't been composted, and also take out any worms that have remained on that side. Right, okay, so if the wormery doesn't sound good and you can't have a compost heap, there are also other things you can try if you want to compost. So I'd recommend looking into bokashi, which is like this organism that you add to your compost, and it ferments it. And the benefit of this is that you can actually compost meat and dairy. And I know a lot of people that live in flats choose this method. You can also ask your local community garden or garden centre if they accept compost. Plattfields Market Garden do accept compost. If you live nearby, feel free to drop that off with us. And you can also look into community composting groups, which is basically like a composting club with your neighbours. There's loads of materials out there if you Google it. So yeah, those are some more ways in which you can compost. And I think that's me done.
Thank you, Klaudia.
Cool.
Really interesting stuff and some practical tips to get people started, which is really useful. Got a few questions. Pauline, she was talking about how she has a compost pile that needs reinvigorating.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any suggestions for maybe it's just a case of adding all the, like bringing those ratios back, you know?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, because once you have the ratios right, things should be fine. So maybe it's just a case of not having a right mix of things in your compost pile. Things aren't breaking down very quickly. It actually might be because there's too much carbon, like I said earlier. So maybe adding more green waste might be one way of reinvigorating that.
Yeah, was saying that she's interested in getting a wormery for her flat, and she says, does it smell? And that she wondering about storing the vermicompost in bags. But you do.
So yeah, in terms of having a wormery in your flat, that's definitely possible. Like I said, you can like literally just stick it under your kitchen sink. It should not smell. If you get things right, they should not smell. Mine never smells. So if it does smell, it might be because you have too much material in there that's starting to break down. So just get rid of that. In terms of storing the compost, I just keep all of mine in my wormery. But yeah, I don't see why you shouldn't be able to just kind of put it to the side and store it in a box or a compost bag.
And then Nico was saying, are red tiger worms indigenous to the UK?
That's an interesting question. I have no idea. I
Did
know.
this have a quick Google before actually? It sounds like they're pretty much indigenous worldwide. They're all over the place, sort of thing. And you do see them just naturally, don't you, out in the soil? It's not. You'll see them in compost bins that you've created yourself outdoors.
Yeah, I found some at Plattfields Market Garden actually. So
Yeah. And Pauline again says she says that they've got a worm farm with a tap on it at their allotment. She says she knows that the juice is good for plants, so the runoff, I guess. Do you know what concentration to use? Have you done that kind of thing before?
yeah, so I kind of don't bother with the like worm tea or worm leachate because I feel like all the goods that you want should be in the compost already. So I kind of don't look into that. But from what I've seen other people use, it by a factor of 10. I think that sounds like a good concentration because that's just what I remember from what other people use.
Says that her compost bin, plastic and slatted, it is, has too many twigs in it. Should I empty it and start again?
No, I just take out some twigs. I think it's okay to like twigs, branches, and stuff like that. They do take quite a long time to break down. So I wouldn't say take all of them out, keep a few in, but if there's too many, then yeah, just take them out. I don't see why you should start again, unless it's...
Jonathan says, is there any risk of adding too much waste to your compost in one go? He says he brews beer, and after dumping a batch of grain and hops in his compost, he noticed a big temperature spike a few hours later. Pile seems fine now, but wondered, is it something I need to be careful of doing in the future?
Yeah, so actually I was reading about how the decomposition process occurs, like what organisms do what, and I think one of the first organisms that you get working through a compost pile are called thermophiles. So those are the ones that work in really high temperatures. So that might explain the temperature spike. But in terms of like, is there any risk of adding too much waste to your compost in one go? I feel like if you have the right mix, that shouldn't really be an issue because you only have issues if you've got the wrong amount of certain stuff. So if you have too much green material or too much nitrogen material, or if you have too much carbon or brown material, that's when things will start to go wrong.
Derek asks, how do you add more bedding? Do you have to dig out all the soil? Will this be explained in the blog post? Oh, I think he's talking about the wormery.
Yeah, you just add it, you just throw it in, and you mix it around. It's just that simple.
Nico asks, actually, are there any signs you've come to notice for worm happiness, as in health signs in the wormery?
I guess at one point where I didn't add any bedding for quite some time, and the worms all seemed to kind of congregate on the edges of the wormery. And I don't know, I think it's because they were essentially living in their own waste for quite some time, which you can imagine isn't nice. So once I've added bedding, I've been able to find them throughout the compost pile a bit more. Yeah, they should just be moving around. Like if you find any worms that are static, I think that's not great, but I'm not sure why that might happen. Yeah.
If you find them in the soil outdoors, they jump around a bit, don't they? They move around. That's why they're called the wrigglers or whatever. So I don't know if that's a bad thing because you've exposed them, or whether they're having the time of their lives. I'm not sure, but
I guess one sign of worm happiness is them reproducing. So you might find your worm read like these little egg-shaped, like oval-shaped yellow eggs, and that means that that's a worm egg, and within 2 weeks you might have some worms hatching. So I assume that's a great sign.
Juliet was saying, do you have to use another compost alongside your wormery for the rest of your food waste? I think my house goes through quite a lot of veg waste every week.
Yes, so I actually drop off my compost at Plattfields Market Garden just because I'm there quite often, so it's just easy for me. The house that I'm moving into soon, I will start a compost, my own compost heap there. If you can, just make a larger wormery to accommodate for more food waste, but obviously that depends on how much space you have. But yeah, I think one drawback of wormeries is that you can't add everything and you can't add too much of it, which is a shame. Like, you don't even have to buy the worms, you can actually just find them in your compost pile, but that might take quite a lot of time to get enough of them. But if you're up for it, then that's something that you can use to practice your earthworm identification skills.
Yeah, I think there's 40 different types of worms in the UK, and they all look very similar. So yeah.
Yep.
You can really see the difference, can't you, between these smallest tiger worms and a typical sort of earthworm.
Mm-hmm.
They look very different. Oh, Jonathan's put a little plug in for his. He's doing the mushroom webinar next week, so I think he's going to talk a little bit how growing mushrooms at home can fit in with composting and vermicomposting. It says, word of caution: earthworms won't survive in a shallow worm bin.
Yeah. My friend had like a relatively shallow worm bin, and the worms died. It was horrendous.
Become your little kind of friends in your cupboard, and you want to look out for them. It's like kind of having a sourdough starter.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else to add?
Yeah, I mean, I've got my own little thing going called the Branch Project, which I mentioned earlier. At the moment, it's in its baby stages. It's just kind of an Instagram account and a blog where I'm both teaching myself and teaching others about all the different ways of sustainable food growing. I'm very interested in finding out more about our food system, the food supply chain, how it all works. So yeah, I'm just kind of interested in educating myself and others on that through various ways, whether that's Instagram posts or blog posts or talks like this.
Okay, I think that's about it then.
Cool. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks very much, Claudia. It's been great. And as I said, and Jonathan mentioned, he has his webinar on growing mushrooms next week. So that'll be some tips about how you can grow them in your own home and the type of mushrooms to choose and maybe what you can do with them as well. Thanks, everyone, and hope everyone has a lovely weekend.